Harlan Voss slammed the tin cup down so hard the coffee splashed across Mara's wrist like a brand. "You call this hot?" he said loud enough for every man around the fire to hear. "My horse pisses warmer than this." 30 pairs of eyes looked away. Not one man said a word. Mara stood there, 20 years old, a widow of 4 months, her wrist stinging, the night wind cutting through a dress that hadn't been properly washed in 2 weeks. She looked at the coffee soaking into the dirt. She looked at Harlan's face, the grin on it, the way he was watching her to see if she'd cry. She picked up the cup. She walked back to the fire. She said nothing. If you've ever had to swallow something that tasted like humiliation just to get through the day, this story is for you. And if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody thought to look at twice, keep watching. Because this is about what happens when that person finally stops being invisible. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning her husband was buried, Mara Whitlock washed the single black dress she owned, hung it to dry on the porch rail, ironed it while it was still slightly damp, and wore it to the service with a composure that people later described as cold. They were wrong about that. She had simply run out of whatever it is that lets a person fall apart in public. All of it had been spent the night before, alone on the kitchen floor of the little house that was no longer hers. Thomas Whitlock had been 24 years old. He'd been thrown from a horse while mending the south fence line, landed badly, and by the time anyone found him, the sun was already low. He died 3 days later in a bed that smelled like camphor and dried blood, and Mara had held his hand through all of it, through the fever, the confusions, the moments when he didn't know where he was or who she was, and she had not let herself break until there was no reason left to hold on. They had been married 14 months. The house belonged to the land company that had leased it to Thomas. The lease died with him. She had 3 weeks to clear out, and the amount of money she found in the tin box beneath the floorboards, the one Thomas had told her was their emergency fund, was enough to last her perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful, less if she wasn't. She was 20 years old, and she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next. Her mother was in Missouri, remarried to a man who had made clear from the beginning that Mara was not his problem. She had 2 friends in town, women who were kind to her face and uncertain what to say. She had no brothers, no father, no uncle who might step in with a solution. What she had was the ability to cook, to sew, to manage a household on almost nothing, and a stubbornness that Thomas had sometimes called her finest quality, and sometimes, in moments of frustration, called something considerably less flattering. She tried 3 different households in Abilene for domestic work. 2 of them told her politely they weren't hiring. The third, a merchant's wife, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, looked Mara up and down and said she didn't take in young widows, as if widowhood were something contagious. She tried the hotel. She tried the dry goods store. She tried the laundry that operated out of a building behind the feed yard, where the work was brutal and the pay was almost nothing. The laundry almost said yes. Then the woman who ran it found out Mara had no permanent address and changed her mind. Postmaster, of all people, who mentioned the cattle drive. He said it almost as an afterthought, sliding her a letter that had come for Thomas 2 weeks too late. Rourke Outfits pushing a herd north next week. Heard they lost their cook to a broken ankle. Probably not something you'd consider. Mara took the letter that would never be read by the man it was written for, thanked the postmaster, and walked directly to the stockyard office where Silas Rourke was supposed to be found. She almost turned back twice on the way there. Not from fear, exactly, or not only from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of having to convince one more person to see her as capable of something. Getting very tired of that specific performance. The straightened spine, the measured voice, the careful management of her own expression, so that she never looked too desperate, never looked too young, never looked like what she actually was. a woman standing at the edge of something, with very little left to lose. Silas Rourke was not what she expected. She had imagined someone louder, given the job. He was a lean man, somewhere in his late 30s, with a face that looked like it had been weathered rather than aged, the kind of face that didn't offer much for free. He was going over a ledger when she came in, and he looked up at her with the specific expression of a man who has been interrupted and is deciding how annoyed to be about it. She told him she was applying for the cook position. He said the position was already being considered by 2 other applicants. She asked him when he needed someone by. He told her 3 days. She told him she could start tomorrow and that she could feed 30 men on the kind of budget that would make a lesser cook weep, and that she had spent the last year managing a household through 2 hard seasons with supplies that would have made most people quit. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way men usually looked at her with that particular inventory, that made her want to cross her arms and step back. He looked at her the way someone looks at an equation they aren't sure they've solved correctly. He said, "You've been on a cattle drive before?" She said, "No. But I've never done most things before I did them the first time." He almost smiled. She wasn't certain. It came and went too quickly. He hired her at $4 a month plus food, told her the chuck wagon left at dawn on Thursday, and went back to his ledger. She walked outside into the afternoon sun and stood there for a moment, with her hands clenched at her sides, not from anger, but from the concentrated effort of not visibly exhaling with relief. $4 a month was not a fortune. The work would be punishing and the company would be rough, and she had never cooked for more than 6 people at a time in her life. But it was something. It was a direction. And after weeks of doors closing quietly in her face, a direction felt like almost enough. She was wrong, of course, about how bad it would get. She usually was in those early weeks. She had a talent for underestimating difficulty right up until it was sitting directly across from her. Crew was 31 men, not counting Silas. They ranged in age from 16, a boy named Pete Garrett, who lied about his age so transparently that half the crew had privately decided to keep an eye on him, to a weathered hand named Clement, who claimed to be 53 and was probably older. They were, as a group, exactly what you would expect from 31 men, who spent most of their lives outdoors doing physically brutal work for modest pay, rough-edged, economical with words, accustomed to a social world that had very specific ideas about where a woman fit into it. Where a woman fit, it turned out, was at the chuck wagon. Mara was not introduced to the crew so much as she was pointed at. Silas said, "Approximately, this is your cook," and 31 pairs of eyes turned toward her with varying degrees of indifference, skepticism, and, in 2 or 3 cases, so much undisguised doubt, and then turned back to whatever they had been doing before. She didn't expect warmth. She hadn't brought any illusions about that with her. But there's a difference between knowing you won't be welcomed and experiencing the specific texture of being looked through, day after day, as if you are a piece of equipment that happens to move around on its own. The chuck wagon was a disaster initially. The previous cook, the man with the broken ankle, had left it in a state of aggressive disorder. Supplies were improperly stored. Several items were nearly expired. The organization of the cooking equipment made no sense whatsoever, and someone had managed to crack the Dutch oven in a way that would be survivable, but would require constant management. She spent the entire first evening reorganizing, taking inventory, calculating how far the supplies would actually stretch versus how far they were supposed to stretch, and arrived at a number that was going to require some creative thinking. She said nothing about this to Silas. Not yet, she would figure it out. She always figured it out. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the work was what she'd expected, which was to say relentless, but because of Harlan Voss. Harlan was one of Silas's senior hands, a big man with a broad face and a way of taking up space that seemed designed to make other people feel they were in the way. He had opinions about the food, the timing of meals, the temperature of the coffee, the softness of the biscuits, the toughness of the beef. He shared these opinions publicly and with enthusiasm. He also had a habit of addressing Mara in a tone that implied she was both stupid and inconvenient, and he did it in front of other men, which was, she understood the point, could manage criticism. She had learned early in life that criticism was sometimes useful and mostly just noise. What she could not manage, what she found, she had less patience for than she'd expected was the performance of it, the way Harlan would wait until there was an audience, the way he'd catch the eyes of other men after he said something, checking to see if they were laughing along. She didn't take the bait, not that first week. She kept her expression neutral and her responses brief, and she put her energy into making the food better, because the food was the argument she was actually in a position to win. But it wore on her, more than she wanted to admit. She'd go to sleep at night under the wagon. She'd been given a bedroll and told this was standard and lie there, in the dark listening to the sounds of 31 men settling into sleep. And she'd think about Thomas, about the kitchen in that little house, about how small and far away her old life felt, and how strange it was that she was here, of all places, on the Texas plain, trying to keep herself from being ground down by a man whose name she hadn't even known 3 weeks ago. It was on the 8th night that it happened. She had gotten the coffee to exactly the right temperature. She had developed a system, holding the cup briefly to test it before serving, and she had brought Harlan's cup with the others, moving through the crew the way she always did, efficiently, without ceremony. Harlan picked up the cup, let it sit for a moment. She was already moving on. "Widow," she stopped. "This cold?" Turned back. It wasn't cold. She knew it wasn't cold. She looked at him and said carefully, "It should be hot. I just poured it." He took a slow sip, made a face that would have been theatrical even on a stage. "My horse pisses warmer than this." The camp went quiet in that particular way. Camps go quiet when something is about to happen. And then his hand shot out, and he slammed the cup down, and the coffee went across her wrist, and she felt the heat of it, and then the sting, and she stood there for one long moment, looking at the wet sleeve of her dress. She looked up, 30 pairs of eyes looking away. Not one word. She picked up the cup, walked back to the fire, poured it out, poured a new cup. She did not cry. She would not cry. But her hand was shaking slightly when she set the new cup down, not from the pain, though it did sting, but from the contained force of not saying what she was thinking. She had become in the past 4 months somewhat expert at containing things. What she didn't see, because her back was turned, was Silas Rourke getting up from where he'd been sitting 20 feet away. She heard about it later, from Pete Garrett, who was 17 and still young enough to be impressed by things. He said Silas had walked up behind Harlan, very quietly, and just stood there until Harlan noticed him. And then Silas had said, "You put your hands near her again. You walk home." Not shouted, not threatened, just said it, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. Harlan had looked like he was going to argue. Then he'd looked at Silas's face and decided not to. When Mara turned back around, Silas was already walking away, and Harlan was staring into the middle distance with an expression she couldn't quite read. She stood there with the fresh cup of coffee in her hand and felt something complicated move through her, something that was part gratitude and part something else she couldn't immediately name, a resistance, a pulling away from the gratitude even as she felt it. She set the cup down in front of Harlan without a word. She walked back to the chuck wagon. She did not want to need to be defended. She had not come on this drive to need things from people. She had come because she had no other option, and she was going to survive it on the strength of her own 2 hands and whatever stubbornness was left in her after everything that had already been taken. But here was the thing she kept running up against, the truth she couldn't quite argue her way out of. She was glad he had said it. She hated that she was glad, but she was. She lay under the wagon that night and looked up at the dark underside of the wagon bed and thought about Thomas, and then thought about the coffee drying on her wrist, and then thought about the particular quiet of Silas Rourke's voice when he'd said what he said. Stars came out, one by one, the way they do in open country. thought, I am not done yet. And then, I need to figure out what to do about those supply numbers before we hit the next town. And then she slept. The supply problem didn't fix itself overnight. Problems rarely did. Mara had spent 3 nights running the numbers in her head before she finally accepted what they told her. At the current rate of consumption, they would run short of flour before the drive reached the Canadian River crossing. Not dangerously short, not in a way that would stop the outfit, but short enough that the men would notice. And in Mara's experience, men who noticed they were getting less food than they expected became men who looked for someone to blame. She already knew who they'd look at. She didn't tell Silas right away. She spent another 2 days first, adjusting portions in ways she hoped were subtle, thickening the stew with more dried corn, stretching the morning biscuits by cutting them slightly smaller, making sure there was always something hot and savory on the table so the quantity of it felt less important than the warmth. It was the kind of calculation that ran in the back of her mind constantly now, a quiet arithmetic she couldn't turn off even when she slept. On the 11th day of the drive, she told him. She found him at the edge of camp in the early morning before the crew was fully awake, checking the horses. Came up beside him and said, without preamble, we have a flour problem. He didn't look up from the horse he was examining. How bad? Manageable if we restock at the next town. Tight if we don't. Next town's Caldwell, 5 days. I know. I can make it 5 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? It was such a direct question that it caught her slightly off guard. She had expected debate, or at least a suggestion that she'd miscalculated. Extra budget at Caldwell. And a heads up if we're going to be delayed. He nodded. Just nodded, like that was the end of it. She turned to go back to the wagon. How'd the flour get short? He asked, still not looking at her. Stopped. The man who packed it underestimated. The count was wrong before I got there. I know, he said. I'm asking because I want to know if you figured that out yourself, or if someone told you. Turned back slightly. I figured it out myself. Night 4. This time he did look at her. Brief assessing. All right. That was the whole conversation. She walked back to the wagon and got the fire started and didn't think too much about the fact that he'd believed her without demanding she prove it. She was used to having to prove things twice. The once was almost disorienting. The days settled into a rhythm that was brutal in its consistency. She was up before anyone else, sometimes an hour before first light, coaxing a fire out of whatever dry material she could find and getting water on to boil before the camp stirred. She cooked breakfast while it was still dark, had it ready when the men came stumbling out of their bedrolls, and immediately began thinking about the noon meal while they ate. By the time the drive was moving, and the chuck wagon was rattling along ahead to set up the next camp, she was already mentally planning what she could do with whatever was left from morning. Cooking on a cattle drive was nothing like cooking in a kitchen. There was no oven that held a consistent temperature, no guaranteed supply of dry wood, no clean surface that stayed clean for longer than 30 seconds. Everything she made had to account for the fact that the fire might be too hot or too cold, that the wind might shift and carry smoke directly into the food. The Dutch oven with the cracked rim had to be positioned just so, or the heat distributed badly and the bottom burned. She'd gotten good at managing all of it, the way you get good at something, when failure has real consequences, not gracefully, not without mistakes, but steadily. The men ate what she put in front of them. They didn't compliment her. That was fine. She hadn't come here for compliments. What she started noticing, around the second week, were the things nobody was saying out loud. Pete Garrett, the youngest hand, had started coming by the wagon in the evenings after the meal was done, ostensibly to return the dishes, but actually she realized to linger. He wasn't much of a talker, but he'd stand there cleaning a cup with his shirt tail and say something like, "Stew was good tonight," and she'd say, "There's more if you want it." And he'd serve himself another bowl and eat standing up by the wagon wheel, and that was the extent of it. Came back, night after night, and she started making sure there was always a little extra in the pot. He was 17 and homesick, and trying very hard not to show it. She recognized the specific posture of someone working to appear more settled than they were. She'd worn it herself for most of the past 4 months. She also noticed that one of the older hands, a quiet man named Doss, who rode drag all day and came into camp, caked in the dust, the herd kicked up, had a persistent cough that sounded worse at night. She started setting aside the broth from the stew separately, and when Doss came in, she made sure his bowl had more liquid than the others. He never said anything about it. She never said anything about it either. It was just a thing that happened. This was the work nobody counted. Not the cooking itself, but the watching. The noticing which men were struggling and which were covering it, which ones needed something warm, and which ones needed to be left alone. She hadn't come on this drive expecting to care about any of these men, and she didn't exactly care. Wasn't quite the right word for it, but she had spent the last 14 months of her life paying close attention to another person's needs, and the habit didn't stop just because the person had changed. Harlan Voss kept his distance after the coffee incident, not because he'd become respectful, she could see that hadn't changed, but because Silas's warning had landed somewhere in him, and he was smart enough not to test it again directly. What he did instead was subtler. The muttered comment. When he walked past the wagon, the way he'd say something to another man, just loud enough for her to hear, the particular way he had of sighing when she set his plate down, as if she were an ongoing inconvenience, he was bearing with tremendous patience. She didn't rise to it. Not because it didn't bother her, it did. In the low-grade way that constant small friction bothers a person, wearing at the edges, but because she had made a decision somewhere around day 6 that Harlan Voss was not going to be what this drive was about for her. He could perform his contempt as long as he wanted. She had work to do. It was around the 15th day that Silas started stopping by the wagon in the mornings. Not to eat, he took his food with the crew, but in the quiet time after breakfast was done, and before the drive started moving, when most of the men were saddling up, and the camp was full of noise and motion. He'd come by while she was packing the wagon, and they'd talk not about anything significant at first, just practical things. The route for the next 2 days, whether she'd noticed any of the supplies running lower than expected, how the remuda was holding up the heat. She was careful with him. She'd learned to be careful with men who seemed decent, because seeming decent and being it were not the same thing, and she'd had enough experience of that gap to treat it seriously. She paid attention to what he did as much as what he said, and what she noticed was that Silas Rourke did not make promises he didn't intend to keep. When he said he'd have the wagon resupplied at Caldwell, the wagon got resupplied. When he said the crew would rest at the river crossing, they rested. He didn't talk about what he was going to do. He just did it, and then moved on. She found that, against her better judgment, restful. Caldwell came and went. She bought what she needed, reorganized the wagon with the precision of someone who'd had to figure out the hard way that bad organization had real costs, and they pushed on north. The country got harder. Not dramatically, the change was gradual enough that you almost didn't notice it happening, but the land grew drier, and the water sources less reliable, and the days longer, the heat holding later into the evening than it had any right to. Cattle slowed slightly. The men grew quieter in the particular way that people grow quiet when they are tired and far from anything familiar. Mara felt it too. The tiredness had gotten into her bones somewhere around the 3rd week and hadn't left. She was sleeping better than she'd expected. Exhaustion was good for that, but the rest wasn't restoring her the way it used to. She'd wake up already accounting for the day ahead, already calculating, already in motion before she was fully conscious. Thomas would have told her to slow down. He'd always said she ran at a pace that was going to catch up with her eventually. He wasn't wrong. He just hadn't lived long enough to see it. She didn't let herself think about him too much. Not because she'd stopped grieving grief. She had come to understand it was not something you stopped. It was something you learned to carry in different positions depending on what you needed your hands for, but because the thinking didn't help, and she needed her mind clear. She kept herself busy, which was not difficult, grins, and she kept herself moving, which was easier than she'd expected. And most days she could go until after dark before she felt the particular weight of his absence settle over her again. It was on the 19th night that the storm came. She'd smelled it first, that specific pressure in the air, the way the wind changed quality rather than direction, something metallic underneath it. She'd grown up in a part of the country where you learned weather the way you learned people, by paying attention to the small signals before the obvious ones arrived. She started preparing before anyone else knew there was anything to prepare for. She moved the most critical supplies, flour, salt, the ammunition box that rode under the wagon into the most protected positions. She found the dry kindling she'd been keeping, wrapped in oilcloth since Caldwell, and tucked it closer to the wagon body. She checked the covers on the food storage, checked the security of the wagon's rigging, and then went to find Silas. "Storm's coming," she said. "Bad one." He looked at the sky. It looked to most people like it always did at that hour. How long? 2 hours, maybe less. He looked at her. Something passed over his face, not doubt. Exactly. But the kind of careful evaluation you give information you can't immediately verify. Then he started moving. He was good at that, making decisions quickly once he'd decided to decide. She went back to the wagon and kept working. She heard the camp shift around her as Silas moved through it, heard the change in men's voices as they understood what was coming, heard the cattle in the distance beginning to express their unease in the low, rolling sound that preceded panic. The storm hit harder than she'd expected and faster. The wind came first, the kind of wind that picks up grit and drives it sideways and makes you keep your head down or lose your eyes to it. The sky to the north lit up in ways that made several of the horses pull badly against their lines. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in what felt like minutes, and the men, most of them, went for the cattle. That was their job. That was the whole point of everything. 2,000 head of cattle represented money, livelihood, an entire season's worth of work. And when the herd started moving wrong, the men moved with them into the darkness, into the wind, and the rain that started shortly after the wind, and the camp emptied out until there was almost nobody left. Mara was left with the wagon, the fire barely, and Pete Garrett, who had been assigned to stay and help her, and looked like he wished he was out in the storm instead, because at least out there he'd have something to do that felt like action. She put him to work immediately. "Hold this," she said, putting a length of canvas in his hands. "Brace it against the wind. Don't let go regardless of what happens." "What are you doing?" he called over the noise. "Making sure there's something hot when they come back." What she was doing was almost certainly not going to work. She knew that. The wind was too strong, the rain too determined, and a fire in those conditions was a thing that happened in theory more than practice. But she had the oilcloth kindling, and she had the side of the wagon as a partial windbreak, and she had an understanding of where to put the Dutch oven to keep it out of the worst of the exposure, and she had absolutely nothing to lose by trying. It took her 4 attempts to get a flame that held. First 3 times it caught, and then guttered out in a gust that came from the wrong angle. She repositioned herself, repositioned the wagon canvas Pete was holding, repositioned the fire kit, and tried again. Her knees were wet, and her hair was a disaster, and at some point she'd bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. But she got the flame on the 4th try, and she held it, feeding it so carefully and so steadily that it felt less like building a fire and more like keeping something alive. She got water on. She got the leftover stew from dinner, which she'd kept in a covered pot, onto the heat. She found coffee, which was not as protected as it should have been, and was slightly damp, and decided it would have to do. She and Pete crouched in the lee of the wagon for 2 hours while the storm did what it was going to do. He didn't talk much. She didn't either. There wasn't much to say, and there was something about the noise of a big storm that made words feel inadequate anyway. He just kept the fire. The men came back in shifts, starting around midnight. Came back wet and cold, and in some cases, shaken, the kind of shaken that comes from spending 2 hours in complete darkness trying to manage a panicked animal that outweighs you by 900 pounds. They came back, and they smelled the coffee before they saw the fire, and several of them stopped in a way that wasn't quite stopping them, more like a small internal recalibration, a moment of not expecting what they found. She put cups in their hands. She ladled stew. She kept her movements economical and her face neutral and didn't make anything of it, because making something of it would have been wrong. This was her job. This was what she was here to do. Something shifted in the camp that night that she didn't fully understand until later. Clement, the oldest hand who said it. He was sitting with his boots off and his wet socks steaming slightly near the fire, working through his second cup of coffee, and he said to nobody in particular, not to her, that fire shouldn't be there. A man named Wick, sitting next to him, said, "Nope." Clement looked over at Mara, who was packing the remaining stew away. "How'd you keep it?" "Oilcloth kindling," she said. Stubbornness. Clement made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Stubbornness. He shook his head slowly. "All right, then." He didn't say anything else. Neither did anyone else. But the air in the camp was different after that. The way air is different, after something changes that can't be changed back, and Mara felt it without being able to put a name to it precisely. She found out later that 3 men had come back from the herd that night with minor injuries. Nothing serious. A twisted knee, a hand cut on wire in the dark. A man named Asa, who'd been thrown and landed on his shoulder and was working hard to convince everyone, including himself, that he was fine. She took stock of what she had in the way of bandaging and ointment, because the drive had a rudimentary medical kit that nobody seemed to have organized or replenished in recent memory, and the next morning she quietly offered to look at Asa's shoulder. He declined, because of course he did. She left the ointment where he could find it without having to ask for it. He used it. She noticed the jar had moved by afternoon. The morning after the storm, Silas came by the wagon earlier than usual. Most of the crew was still sleeping or moving slowly, the way men move when they have been cold and wet and frightened and would like to sleep for another week. He came by while she was getting the breakfast fire started, before the light was fully up. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood there with his hat in his hands. She'd never seen him without the hat, looking at the wagon, at the fire, at the setup she'd put together the night before. Then he said, "The oilcloth kindling was yours?" "Yes." "You packed it at Caldwell?" "I've been carrying it since Abilene. Bought it the day before we left." He was quiet again. She added wood to the fire, careful with it, still conserving from force of habit. "You knew we'd need it," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I knew something would go wrong eventually," she said. "Something always does." He put his hat back on, looked out at the flat country north of them, pale and washed and still wet from the night. "I've been doing this 11 years, he said. "I had one cook think ahead like that. What happened to him?" "Retired. Opened a hotel in Denver, last I heard." She almost smiled. Smart man," he agreed. He got his coffee and went to check on the herd, and Mara got breakfast going, and the drive moved on north, the way it always did, because that was what drives did. They moved forward. Whatever happened, they kept moving forward. But something had changed. She felt it in the way the men came to the wagon, now not less rough, not suddenly warm, because that wasn't who they were, and she didn't want performance, but differently. Less like she was furniture they were working around. More like she was a fixed point in a moving landscape, something that would be where it was supposed to be. She still lay under the wagon at night, still thought about Thomas more than she wanted to, still woke at 4 in the morning with numbers running in her head, still spent 20 minutes every evening, wondering if she'd made the right call about the proportions, still felt the specific loneliness of being the only woman in 30 miles in any direction. But the ground felt different under her now. Harder? Maybe. More real. Like something she could actually stand on. Silas began stopping by the wagon most mornings now, and the conversations had shifted without either of them, quite deciding to shift them. He asked about things she'd noticed, which men were struggling, where he should watch for trouble. Answered honestly. because she'd decided early on that honest and useful were more valuable than careful and vague. And he listened, the way people listen when they're actually using what they hear, rather than just waiting for their turn to talk. She told him about Doss's cough. He'd already noticed, but didn't know how to address it without making the man feel singled out. They worked out a solution together, a slightly longer rest at midday that benefited the whole crew, but was timed around when Doss's cough was worse. It wasn't elegant. It helped. She told him about Pete, the way the boy was struggling with something he wasn't saying. Silas looked at her for a moment and then said, "I know. He found out before we left that his father's been sick. Didn't want to stay. Why did he come? Same reason most of them do." He wrapped both hands around his cup. They need the money, and they don't know what else to do. She understood that. She understood it specifically and personally, and without any distance. "I'm going to start giving him a specific job each morning," she said. "Something to think about." Silas looked at her sideways. "You're the cook." "I'm aware," she said. "He can help me. I need someone to collect firewood before we break camp anyway. It'll give him something." Silas considered this all right. Pete started collecting firewood. He was good at it, methodical, thorough, the kind of worker who finished the task you gave him and then looked for what came next without being asked. She started teaching him small things, how to read a fire, how to manage heat in the Dutch oven, things he'd probably never use again in his life, but that gave him something to focus on. He didn't talk about his father. She didn't ask. But he came to the wagon in the mornings with slightly less of that hollow underwater quality in his eyes, and she counted that as something. It was sometime during the third week that she admitted to herself, quietly and without any particular drama, that this was harder than she'd expected, and also more than she'd expected. She had come on this drive because she had no other option, and she had expected to endure it, to get through it the way you get through something difficult, by going straight at the difficulty and not stopping. She had not expected to find it interesting. She had not expected to find the men, or most of them, understandable. She had not expected to notice how much she was capable of, or to discover that the work, the actual daily work of feeding people well in hard conditions, was something she was genuinely good at in a way she hadn't known to name before. Thomas had known. He'd told her once that she had a gift for making things work that other people would have given up on. She'd told him that wasn't a gift, it was just stubbornness, and he'd said there was a kind of stubbornness that was indistinguishable from talent. She thought about that sometimes. In the early mornings before the camp woke, when the sky was doing that thing it did on the plains, before the sun came fully up, that gray-going gold that looked like something being made rather than something just happening. She was not happy exactly. Happy felt like the wrong word for what she was. She was something more like functional, more like herself than she'd been in months. She supposed that was enough to keep going on. She did not let herself think about what came next. After Kansas, after the drive ended, after the $4 a month was paid out, and she was standing in some town with a bedroll and a skill set, and no particular future, she didn't let herself go there. One day at a time, one meal at a time. That was all she had to manage. She repeated this to herself most evenings. It mostly worked. The cattle moved north. The days grew slightly cooler. Harlan Voss kept his distance and his muttered comments, and Mara kept her fire and her numbers and her careful attention to 31 men who were starting, without any of them quite deciding to count on her in ways that went beyond the food. She was not safe. She was not settled. She was not sure of anything past the next few days. But she was useful, and she was capable, and she was still standing. For now, that had to be enough. The smell hit her before anything else did. She was at the wagon, 3 days north of the Cimarron crossing, working through the midday cleanup while the herd rested, and the men ate in the loose, exhausted way they ate when the heat was high, and conversation felt like too much effort. She had her back to the south when she caught it, something underneath the dry grass smell, something with an edge to it, acrid and faint but unmistakably wrong. Straightened up. She turned around and looked at the horizon to the southwest and saw nothing. Blue sky, flat land, the heat shimmer that made distance unreliable. Nothing that looked like a problem. She smelled it again. She went to find Silas. He was talking to Wick near the remuda, something about one of the horses that had been moving stiff on the left foreleg since morning. She came up beside him and said, quietly enough that she wasn't interrupting, "Something's burning to the southwest." He looked at her. Then he looked southwest. "I don't see anything." "I know. I smell it." He held still for a moment in the way he'd learned to hold still when she said something he couldn't immediately confirm. In 3 weeks, she had been wrong about the weather. Once she'd called for rain that came 6 hours later than she'd predicted, and right about enough other things that he had developed, without making a production of it, a habit of taking her observations seriously before deciding they were wrong. He lifted his head and turned slightly into the wind. His expression changed. "Wick," he said, "get up on the wagon. Look southwest." Wick climbed up on the chuck wagon wheel and used the height and shaded his eyes and was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "Smoke. Low. Maybe 4 miles." The camp moved differently after that. Not panic. Silas didn't run a camp that panicked, but the quick, purposeful reorganization of people who understand that time has become a different kind of resource. He sent 2 riders out to get a better look. He started moving the remuda to the northeast. He told the men, who were still eating, to finish fast and be ready to move. He came to Mara. "How quickly can you break down the wagon?" 50 minutes if I'm careful. Less if I'm not." "Be not careful," he said. "Move the wagon north along the creek bed. Keep the water between you and whatever's coming." She was already moving before he finished the sentence. This was the part she hadn't anticipated about this work, not the difficulty of it. She'd expected difficulty, but the way emergency revealed something about a person's actual capability versus their estimated capability. She had thought of herself as competent. She had not known until now that competent, under pressure, looked like this. Her hands moving through familiar tasks at unfamiliar speed. Her mind tracking 6 things simultaneously. Her body doing what it needed to do without waiting for her brain to catch up. She broke the camp down in 16 minutes. Pete Garrett helped her, working with the wordless efficiency of someone who has learned to read the urgency in another person's movements and match it. He didn't ask questions. She didn't explain. They just moved, and the wagon was loaded and rolling north, along the creek bed before the riders came back with their report. The report was not good. The fire was moving fast, driven by a south wind that had been building since morning, and it had already consumed more ground than anyone had estimated from the initial smoke sighting. 2 riders had gotten close enough to see the fire line itself, a low, rolling orange that stretched east to west as far as they could see, eating the dry grass with the specific appetite of something that has been hungry for a long time. It was still 4 miles out. In good conditions, 4 miles was manageable. In a south wind with dry fuel, 4 miles was 20 minutes, maybe less. The cattle knew before the men did. She could hear them from the creek bed, the change in their collective sound, a restlessness that had no specific direction yet, just energy building in 2,000 animals who smelled smoke and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. That undirected energy was in its way more frightening than a stampede. Stampede had momentum you could work with. This was potential, which was harder. Silas and the crew went for the herd. Mara positioned the wagon, found the best spot she could. Along the creek bank, a place where the bank itself provided a natural barrier, where the water was close enough to matter, where the wagon could sit with the creek between it and the south. She didn't know if it was the right call. She made it anyway, because the alternative was standing still, and she had never been any good at that. She wet down everything she could, soaked the canvas covers, soaked the supply bags, pulled water up from the creek in the cooking pots, and sloshed it across the wagon's wooden sides. The water was cold and dark and smelled like mud, and she didn't care. She worked until her arms ached, and then she kept working. Smoke was visible now. a brown-gray line low on the southern horizon that grew thicker while she watched. And then she heard it underneath the wind, underneath the sound of the cattle, a sound that was less a sound than a feeling, something deep and rolling that she felt in her chest before she identified it with her ears. The herd was moving. She climbed up on the wagon seat and looked east and saw the dust. Nearly 2,000 cattle running north and running badly, not the directed, manageable movement of a herd being pushed by riders, but the spreading, spilling, unraveling movement of animals in genuine terror. The edges of the herd were already breaking away from the main body. Dust they raised was so thick it blurred everything behind it, turned the men on horseback into gray shapes that appeared and disappeared in the murk. She looked for Silas in the dust. She couldn't find him. What she could see from the wagon seat was something the men in the dust couldn't, the shape of where the herd was going and what was in the way. Creek bent to the northeast, a quarter-mile from where she was sitting, and the ground between the bend and the wagon was flat and open, and that was where the main body of the cattle was heading, not toward the wagon directly, but close enough that the geometry of it was bad. The herd would pass between her and the bend, funneled by the creek bank on one side and the open ground on the other, and anything caught in that funnel was going to have a problem. She was still looking at the dust when she saw the horse go down. She saw it the way you see something you're not prepared to see, not all at once, but in pieces that assemble into a meaning she didn't want. A shape in the gray murk, a sudden absence, a horse that had been there and then wasn't, and a man going down with it, down into the path of the herd. She knew it was Silas before she could have said how. She knew it. She did not make a decision. She did not weigh options or calculate risk or do any of the careful, considered things she might have described herself as doing afterward, because afterward was a different country and right now was only right now. She dropped off the wagon seat and she ran to the back of the wagon and she found the bullwhip. It had been there since Abilene, not hers, left by the previous outfit, looped on a hook inside the wagon bed. She had noticed it on the first day and left it alone because she had never used one and didn't expect to need to. Took it now and got back to the ground and ran. She ran toward the stampede. There was a part of her, some rational background part, that was observing all of this from a slight remove, that understood this was probably the most dangerous thing she had ever done, and that she was doing it anyway. And that part of her had no ability whatsoever to stop the rest of her, which was already committed and moving. The noise was enormous. The ground was vibrating under her feet, actually vibrating, a deep, constant tremor that she felt through her boot soles and up into her shins. The dust was thick enough that she pulled her neckerchief up over her mouth and nose, and it helped only slightly. Taste the grit of it, could feel it in her eyes, and she narrowed them and kept moving. She had to get to the flank. She understood this without having thought it through. Going at the front of a stampede was suicide. Going at the rear was useless. The only place you could do anything was the flank. The edge of the moving mass where a single point of pressure could begin to alter direction. She'd seen Thomas work cattle enough times to know the theory. She had never done it. She had never done most things before she did them the first time. She angled right and ran hard. The first crack of the whip was terrible. She had aimed for the air above the cattle on the flank and instead caught the ground 3 feet short, a sound that was loud and useless and sent a jolt up her arm that she wasn't prepared for. Cattle near her shied but didn't turn. She reset and tried again. The second crack was better. High, sharp in the right direction. 2 cattle on the outer edge of the flank startled left. Kept moving, kept cracking, kept positioning herself along the edge of the herd the way she'd seen riders do on horseback, but she was on foot, which meant she was slower and lower, and the margin for error was essentially nothing. One wrong step, one stumble, and the herd would go over her without the animals even registering she was there. She did not think about this. She thought about the geometry, the direction of the cattle, the angle she needed to maintain. She cracked the whip again and again, working the flank, driving the edge animals left, trusting because she had to trust something, that if the edge moved, the center would follow. Her hand started hurting on the fourth or fifth crack. She'd gotten the motion slightly wrong, and the handle had torqued in her grip, and the skin on her palm was burning in a specific way that meant she'd done damage. She switched to a two-handed grip, which made the motion harder and the accuracy worse, and she kept going. The herd was beginning to curve. Slowly, these things happened slowly. The turning of a mass that large, but she could see it. The outer edge of the flank bending left. The cattle behind, following the ones in front, the way they always did. Curve becoming a thing that had its own momentum now. She was 30 feet from where Silas had gone down. Couldn't seize him. She could see the horse on its feet again, which meant the fall hadn't been catastrophic. But it was moving away and the saddle was empty and she couldn't see Silas in the dust. Cracked the whip harder. Kept driving left. The curve of the herd steepened, and then she saw him. He was on the ground, one knee up, one hand on the dirt, pushing himself up with the careful slowness of someone who has been hit and doesn't know the full extent of the damage yet. He was 8 feet from the edge of the herd's path, which was close enough that she could see the individual cattle thundering past just beyond him, close enough that the wind from their movement was visible in the grass near his face. She cracked the whip twice more, hard, angled directly at the nearest edge cattle, driving them left with everything she had. The herd went left. Not all at once, not cleanly, not in any way that anyone would have looked at and called graceful. The edge cattle peeled away, and the ones behind them followed, and the main body of the herd bent around the obstacle of Silas Rourke's prone body like water going around a stone. And then they were past, thundering north into the open ground, and the sound was moving away, and the dust was still enormous, but beginning slowly to disperse. Mara stopped. Her hand was shaking. Both hands were shaking. She realized not the controlled shaking of exertion, but the uncontrolled shaking of a body that had been running on something other than normal fuel and was now being asked to stop. She looked down at her right palm and saw that the skin across the base of her fingers was raw and bright, the kind of damage that hadn't started hurting yet but would. She walked toward where Silas was. He was up, both feet on the ground, which she counted as excellent news. He had his hat off. She still hadn't gotten used to seeing him without the hat, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. It wasn't the expression she'd expected. She'd expected something practical, some rapid assessment of the situation. Instead, it was something more complicated than that, something that had several things in it at once. "You all right?" she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, like she'd been shouting, though she didn't remember shouting. "Am I?" He stopped. Started again. "You ran at the stampede." "Yes, on foot." "Yes, with a whip you've never used." She looked at the whip, still in her hand. "I've been watching the hands for 3 weeks," she said. "I had a general idea." He stared at her for a moment. A general idea. It worked. Mara. He said her name the way people say a name when they don't have a better word for what they're trying to say. Just the name, standing in for something larger. She became aware, standing there, of how much of her body hurt. The hand was going to be the worst of it. But there was also her knee, which she must have hit at some point without noticing, and her lungs, which were reminding her that she had been running hard in heavy dust for several minutes. She breathed carefully and looked at the dispersing herd and thought, this is probably the part where her legs give out, except she was not going to let that happen in front of anyone. "Your hand," Silas said. She looked down at it again. "Fine. Let me see it." "It's fine, Mara." She held it out because arguing required energy she didn't currently have. He looked at the palm carefully, tilting it toward the light, and his face did something that she interpreted as concern, which was unexpected. She had not thought of herself as someone whose palm would produce concern in Silas Rourke. "I have ointment in the wagon," she said. "I know you do. You have everything in that wagon." He released her hand. "You need to let someone look at it properly." "I'm the someone who looks at things properly." "Then let yourself look at it properly." He paused. "After you sit down for 5 minutes. I don't need Mara. He said it differently this time, quietly, without pressure, just a request. 5 minutes. Then you can go back to running everything. She sat down on a flat rock at the edge of the creek. 5 minutes felt, in the way that 5 minutes feels after something, like what had just happened, both very short and very long. The adrenaline was leaving her, draining out through her feet, it felt like. And what was underneath it was not the collapse she'd half expected, but something more like clarity. The particular stripped-down clarity and having been genuinely afraid and come out the other side of it. She had been afraid. She hadn't known it in the moment, or rather she had known it the way you know a fact that isn't currently relevant. But sitting here now, she could feel it retrospectively, the fear that had been running parallel to everything she was doing, like a river next to a road, present but separate. She looked at her hand. The damage was real but manageable. She'd had worse working the lye soap in the laundry that had almost hired her in Abilene. Around her, the camp was reassembling itself. Men came back in from the dust. Riders appeared out of the murk. The sounds of the herd settled from the thunder of panic into the lower, collective noise of 2,000 animals milling in the aftermath of fright. Someone had recovered Silas's horse. She could hear voices she recognized. The crew doing the head count they always did after something went wrong, accounting for people and animals the way she accounted for supplies. Pete Garrett came running. He stopped 8 feet away, looked at her hand, looked at the whip still lying on the ground nearby, and visibly reorganized several things he'd been about to say. Came out was, "Are you hurt bad?" "No," she said. "I saw you." He stopped. "From the wagon." "I saw you run toward." He stopped again. He was 17 and didn't have the words for it yet. "Go check the supplies," she said. "Tell me what we lost in the move." He went. She watched him go and thought that he'd needed something to do more than she'd needed the information, though she did need the information. Silas came back. He sat down on the ground near the rock, not on the rock with her, not close, just nearby, and for a while neither of them said anything. The silence between them had changed in the past 3 weeks. It had become the kind of silence that is comfortable rather than empty, the kind that doesn't require filling. "My horse hit a prairie dog hole," he said, after a while. "I know, I saw him go down," I thought. He paused. "When I was on the ground and the herd was coming, I thought I'd made every calculation right, and it hadn't mattered. Done everything the way you're supposed to do it, and still ended up on the wrong side of the math. Thought about that. That happens." "Yeah, it does." He looked at the whip, and then the herd turned. "It was turning before I got there," she said. "The front of it was already breaking. I just pushed the flank." "Don't do that," he said. "Do what?" "Make it smaller than it was." She was quiet for a moment. "I made it the size it was." The herd was already moving. The herd would have gone right over me if the flank hadn't turned when it did," he said. "And you know that as well as I do." She did know it. She had done the geometry in real time, in the dust and noise, and she knew exactly where the herd had been, relative to where he was, and how many seconds had been left. She had not let herself think about those seconds until now. Now, sitting on the flat rock with the crisis behind her, and her hand hurting, and her body coming down from whatever it had been running on, she let herself think about them for a moment. They were a very small number of seconds. "You could have been killed," Silas said. "So could you, I know." "I'm stopped." "Try it again." "I'm saying I'm aware of what you did and what it cost, and I don't intend to let it go unremarked." She looked at him. His face was still slightly gray under the trail dust, the color of a man whose body remembered being in a bad place even after his mind had moved on. She thought about what it had been like to see him on the ground with the herd coming, the particular sensation that had shot through her in that moment, not just urgency, but something more specific, more personal than urgency. She was going to have to think about that later. Not now. "Consider it remarked," she said, "and then let's figure out what the drive lost in that stampede." He almost smiled. The same way he'd almost smiled when she'd told him she'd never done most things before, the first time she did them. Like something wanted to be a smile and was deciding how much to commit. Right, he said. He got up, offered her his hand, took it and stood, and her knee reminded her it was unhappy about something. She didn't show this the herd, she asked. We're short, maybe 200 head scattered into the creek bottoms. We'll spend the rest of the day gathering. He looked at the sky, which was clear and blue and entirely indifferent to what had just happened beneath it. We'll camp here tonight. I'll have dinner ready. You need to deal with your hand first. I can do both. He looked at her. Yes, he said, like he was agreeing with something he'd known for a while. But can. The gathering took the rest of the afternoon as he'd predicted. She worked on her hand with the same kit she'd used on Asa's shoulder, cleaned it, applied ointment, wrapped it in a way that would let her still use it without making the damage worse, and then got the fire going and started dinner. Her right hand was awkward, painful in certain positions, and she shifted the work to compensate the way you shift weight off a sore foot. Slowed her down. She managed. The men came back in ones and twos through the late afternoon, trail dirty and tired in the specific way that comes from a day that has taken more than the usual. Coffee ready. She had stew ready, richer than usual, because she had decided that tonight warranted the extra beans. Nobody said anything about the stampede directly, but the camp was different, not louder, not more convivial, but something more like honest, stripped of the performance people put up when the day has been ordinary. Clement sat by the fire for a long time after dinner, longer than usual, not talking. Wick and two other men played cards, but without much conviction. Pete Garrett returned to his spot by the wagon and sat there in his version of silence, which was slightly noisier than an adult's, because he was 17, and silence didn't come as naturally yet. Harlan Voss said nothing to her. He ate his food and drank his coffee and looked at the fire, and for once didn't perform anything. She didn't know if it was what had happened or just the general exhaustion of the day, and she didn't particularly care. Quiet was welcome. Silas sat with the crew for a while, making his rounds the way he did every evening, and then he came to the wagon. She was cleaning up, her wrap, making certain movements awkward, working through it. He stood there and watched her for a moment without offering to help, because he'd learned early on that offering to help was something she received with suspicion. Then he said, "The men saw what you did today. They were busy, not all of them." Clement was watching from the rise. Wick came back early and saw the last part. He paused. Word travels in a crew. She kept cleaning. It doesn't change anything. It changes how they see you. That's their business. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've been holding this crew together since Abilene, not just the food. All of it, the supplies, the watching, the storm. Today, he stopped. I need you to know I see that. She stopped what she was doing, turned around to look at him. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides, hat in his hand again, looking at her with that expression. She still couldn't fully categorize the one that had several things in it, things she wasn't sure she was ready to name. I see it, he said again. She nodded slowly. Okay, he said. He put his hat back on. Sleep, your hand needs rest. I know what my hand needs. I know you know. He turned to go. Then, without turning back, Mara, thank you. She stood at the wagon and watched him walk back to where the fire was burning down. Watched him settle into the camp the way he always did. And she thought about the seconds again. The ones on the ground, the herd coming, the geometry of it. She thought about how the right thing to do, the sensible, self-preserving thing to do, would have been to stay at the wagon. She knew that. She had known it while she was doing the other thing. She thought about what it meant that she had done the other thing anyway. She didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. She was 20 years old, and she had just turned a stampede on foot, and her hand hurt, and she was in the middle of a cattle drive in Indian Territory, with no particular future planned beyond Kansas, and she did not have the luxury of spending too much time on questions that didn't have immediate answers. She wrapped the whip carefully and put it back where she'd found it, on the hook inside the wagon. She lay down under the wagon with her bedroll. She looked up at the underside of the wagon bed, the same view she'd had every night for 3 weeks. And she listened to the camp settle and the cattle murmur in the dark, and the wind moving through the grass. Her hand throbbed steadily. She thought, I am still here. And then, just before sleep took her, I did not know I could do that. She held that thought for a moment, turned it over, found it solid. Then she slept. Her hand healed crooked. Not dramatically, it wasn't the kind of damage that would cripple her or slow her down in any permanent way, but the skin across the base of her fingers had tightened as it healed, pulling slightly in a way that she noticed most in the early mornings when the air was cold and the first movements of the day were stiff. She'd done what she could with the ointment and the wrapping and the careful management of how she used it. The truth was, she hadn't rested it the way it needed resting, because there was no version of this drive where she stopped using her hands for a week. And so it had healed the way things heal when they don't get the conditions they need, adequately, functionally, with a small permanent record of what had happened written into the tissue. She didn't mind. She had other scars. Most of them didn't show. The drive moved north, and the country changed around them in the gradual way that made you doubt the change until you looked back and realized how far you'd come from where you'd started. The grass was different here, shorter and sparser, and the sky had a quality she hadn't known how to describe until Clement told her, on one of the evenings, when he sat by the wagon longer than usual, that Montana sky looked like this wide and pale, at the edges deep blue overhead, the kind of sky that made a person feel both very small and very present at the same time. Thought about that for days afterward. Very small and very present. That was, she'd decided, a reasonably accurate description of how she'd been feeling for the past month. The crew had changed around her, and she had changed within it. And neither of those things had happened with any particular announcement. It was the accumulation of days. Clement sitting by the wagon. Wick asking her once, with the awkward brevity of a man who didn't ask for things easily, if she had anything for a headache that had been sitting behind his eyes for 2 days. Doss's cough getting better. She wasn't sure if that was the broth or just time, but she preferred to think it was the broth. Garrett, who had started as someone she was keeping an eye on, becoming someone she relied on, which was a transition she hadn't seen coming and found. When she noticed it, unexpectedly moving. Even the men who never spoke to her directly had shifted. She could see it in the small things, the ways they cleaned their plates more thoroughly, before returning them, the way they'd started, without being asked, moving out of her path when she was carrying something. None of it was warmth, exactly. It was something more durable than warmth. It was the particular respect that comes from watching someone do something hard and do it well, and having no argument left against them. Harlan was the exception. Harlan was always the exception. He had been quiet since the stampede quiet, in a way that was different from his previous quiet, which had been the quiet of someone holding something in reserve. This was a more unsettled quiet, the quiet of a man who has watched something happen that has rearranged his understanding of a situation and hasn't yet decided what to do with the rearrangement. She saw it sometimes when she caught him looking at her, not the contempt she'd gotten used to, but something more complicated. Something that might have been, in a person with more self-awareness, closer to shame. She didn't trust it. She had learned the hard way that a person who had treated you badly going quiet was not the same thing as a person who had changed. It might mean that. It might mean they were just waiting for a different opportunity. She kept her distance and her attention, and let him work through whatever he was working through on his own time. The bigger shift, the one she spent more time not thinking about, because thinking about it required a kind of honesty she wasn't ready for, was Silas. The morning conversations had become something she counted on. Not in a way she'd admitted to herself. She was careful about admitting things to herself that she couldn't immediately do something about, but in the quiet way that you count on something without deciding to. The way you rely on a particular rhythm until it's interrupted, and the interruption is what tells you how much the rhythm had mattered. He talked to her differently than he talked to the crew. Not softer Silas Rourke was not a soft man, and she didn't want him to be, but more directly. He said what he thought rather than what he'd calculated it was useful to say, and she had come to understand that this was not something he did with everyone. She'd watched him manage the crew with a particular kind of communication that was measured and strategic and effective, and then come to the wagon and talk to her like someone who had put the managing down for a moment. She liked that. She distrusted how much she liked it. The drive was 17 days from Kansas, when the night conversation happened that she would spend a long time afterward turning over in her mind, examining from different angles the way you examine something you've found on the ground, not sure if it's valuable or just interesting, not sure what to do with it either way. It was late. Most of the crew was asleep. The fire had burned down to the kind of low orange that gave heat without much light, and she was finishing the last of the evening cleanup when Silas came and sat near the fire. Not at it, near it, a few feet back the way he sat, when he had something on his mind that he was still deciding whether to say. She let the silence be. She'd learned that pressing Silas Rourke to talk before he was ready produced nothing useful. She finished the cleanup. She poured herself the last of the coffee, which was too strong and slightly burned from sitting on the heat too long, and she sat on the upturned crate she used as a seat and waited. He said, "Tell me something about yourself. Something that's not about the drive." She looked at him over the cup. "That's a strange request. I know." He was looking at the fire. "I know more about how you manage a supply shortage than I know about where you're from." "Missouri," she said. Originally, my mother remarried when I was 12. I didn't get along with her husband. I left when I was 17. She paused. Came to Kansas with a family that needed a hired girl. Met Thomas. She stopped there because the rest of it was recent enough to still have edges. "Thomas," he said. Not a question. He knew the outline. He'd known she was widowed from the beginning. "We were married 14 months, she said. He was a good man. He didn't know how to be careful." She looked at the coffee. "Some people aren't made for being careful. They're made for other things. He was made for being kind." Silas was quiet for a moment. "My wife was made for other things too," he said. "She was made for, I don't know exactly, bigger things than what I gave her. She wanted to go to San Francisco. She wanted to see things." He paused. "She died without seeing them." Mara looked at him. This was the most he had ever said about his wife in one piece. She didn't say anything, because this was clearly not finished. "She died 2 years ago," he said. "Fever. It was fast." He paused again, longer this time. "I have 2 children. Nolan is 11. Elsie is 8. He looked at the fire. "Nolan has gotten old since she died. 8-year-old boys shouldn't get old. Elsie, she's managing. Or she's pretending to. I can't always tell the difference." "Those are the same thing sometimes," Mara said. "Managing and pretending. They overlap." He looked at her. "Yes, they do." The fire popped. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses shifted against its line. "I have a woman from town who comes in to cook and help with the house," he said. "Mrs. Alderman. She's capable. The children don't dislike her." He paused. "But it's not stopped." "It's not a home," Mara said. He looked at her again. "No, it's a house with people in it." She understood that. She understood it in her bones. The specific difference between a house with people in it and a place that was actually home. She had not had the latter since before her mother remarried, and she had thought, briefly, she was building it with. Thomas had thought the small house, and the 14 months, and the careful plans were the beginning of something that was going to keep growing. And then it had not. "The ranch is good land," he said. "Northern Montana. We're near the Yellowstone. Good water. Good grass. The herd I'm bringing back will double what I have." He paused. "It's a lot of work for one person." She didn't say anything. She was being careful. "I need someone who can run a household," he said. "Who can manage the ledgers when I'm out on the range and help me think through problems and not fall apart when things go wrong." He stopped. "That's not a small list of things." "No," she said. "Not. Mara." He said her name, the way he'd said it after the stampede, like the name was carrying something larger than itself. "I'm asking if you'd come to Montana." She held very still. "Not as the cook," he said. The fire was low between them. The skies above was full of stars in the particular unobstructed way that the plain sky is full of stars. More stars than seemed reasonable, more stars than you remembered, there being when you weren't paying attention. Thought about several things at once. She thought about Nolan, who had gotten old. She thought about Elsie, who was either managing or pretending to. She thought about the ranch near the Yellowstone and the ledgers that needed managing and the life that was a lot of work for one person. She thought about the 14 months with Thomas and the tin box under the floorboards and the woman who didn't hire young widows because she found them inconvenient. She thought about the fact that she had, on a flat rock by a creek in Indian Territory, decided she was not done yet. "I'm not going to answer that tonight," she said. He nodded. She could see from his face that this was not a surprise. "All right. I need you to understand that," she said. "I'm not being—" She stopped. "Try it again. I have spent the last 4 months making decisions because I had no other choice. I don't want to do that again. When I decide something, so I want it to be because I actually decided it." He looked at her steadily. "I understand that." "I'm not sure you do," she said, not unkindly. "Men generally don't, in my experience. There's an answer they expect, and they interpret the delay as a negotiation rather than a genuine." "Mara," he stopped her. "I'm not in a hurry. The drive ends in Kansas. You'll have time between here and there." He paused. "I'll still be asking after Kansas if that's when you're ready. Or I won't ask again if that's what you need." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. He got up, put his hat on. "Good night. Good night." She watched him walk to where he slept, and she sat by the dying fire and thought about what had just happened with the specific clarity that came, sometimes, at the end of a very long day. She thought about it carefully and honestly, and without the self-protective softening she sometimes applied to things she wasn't ready to look at directly. She did not want to go to Montana because she was afraid of what came after Kansas. She had told herself that, and she was going to keep telling herself that until she was certain it was true and not just convenient. She did not want to marry a man simply because he was decent and she was alone. She had watched women do that, make pragmatic choices that they dressed up as something else, and live inside those choices for the rest of their lives with a certain flatness behind their eyes. She did not want that flatness. She had rather have the uncertainty. But she was also 20 years old, and she was not a fool, and the honest part of her that she couldn't fully silence said, "There is a difference between making a choice from fear and making a choice because you want it, and you are going to have to figure out which one this is before Kansas." She got up and went to her bedroll. The stars were still unreasonably numerous above her. She slept. The next 9 days were neither easier nor harder than the ones before them, which was its own kind of answer, she supposed, to some question she hadn't fully articulated. She watched herself. She watched how she felt in the mornings when Silas came to the wagon, whether it was obligation or something else. She watched how the day felt different when he was nearby versus when he was out with the herd. She was methodical about this, in the same way she was methodical about supplies, no sentimentality, just honest accounting. The accounting was uncomfortable. That was probably what honest accounting was supposed to feel like. She also watched Harlan. She watched him the way you watch something at the edge of your vision that you aren't sure is moving, not because she feared him, exactly, but because she'd learned to treat unresolved things as potential problems. He had been quiet for nearly 2 weeks, which was not his natural state, and quiet people who are usually loud were doing something in that quiet, even if they didn't know what yet. She found out what on the 16th day from Kansas. They were 2 days out. The end of the drive had become visible in the way that ends become visible, not a single event, but a gradual accumulation of signs. The country shifting, the mood of the crew shifting, particular tired and almost done quality that was different from the regular exhaustion of trail life. The men were talking about what they'd do with their pay. Some of them were making plans that sounded real, and some were making plans that sound like the kind you make when you need to believe in something getting better. She had gotten up before dawn to get ahead of the day. They'd be in Caldwell by nightfall tomorrow, and Dodge by the day after, and she was already thinking about how to manage the final supply accounting. What to return, what to declare used, how to do the handoff of the chuck wagon in a way that was clean. She had her back to the camp and was doing the pre-dawn fire preparation when she heard the voices. Harlan's voice first. Then another man she thought it was a hand named Briggs, who was friendly with Harlan in the particular way that men are friendly with someone they aren't sure they actually like but find useful. She couldn't hear the words clearly from where she was, but she caught the tone, and the tone was wrong in the specific way that conversation you aren't supposed to hear is usually wrong. She went still and listened. She heard her name, then Silas's name, then a phrase she caught cleanly because Harlan wasn't bothering to be especially quiet, probably because he thought she was further away than she was. Plain little cook, and then a laugh. Briggs's laugh, and then man saves a woman off the street and thinks she's something special. It's Rourke's problem. Always been soft-hearted for strays. Stayed where she was. She let the words sit in the air for a moment, and then she assessed them the way she assessed everything. What was actually here, what was just noise, what required a response and what didn't. She decided it required no response from her. It wasn't about her, not really. It was about Harlan needing to put something back in an order that had been disturbed. And the way he was doing that was by diminishing what she'd done until it fit into a category he was comfortable with. She understood the impulse. She didn't respect it. Turned back to the fire. She got it started. She began the breakfast. What she didn't know because her back was to the camp was that Silas had been awake. She found out later from Pete, who had also been awake, and had watched the whole thing from his bedroll, with the particular attentiveness of someone who is young enough to still be surprised when adults behave badly. He told her Silas had stood up from where he'd been sitting, not running but walking with that particular steadiness he had, and gone over to where Harlan and Briggs were standing. He didn't tell her exactly what was said. He said Silas's voice had been quiet, which was always the thing to pay attention to with Silas, the quietness. He said Harlan had started to argue, which was also predictable, and that Silas had let him get through the argument, and then had said something that Pete hadn't fully heard, but that had made Harlan go very still. She would have left it there, except that it didn't leave itself there, because Harlan, having apparently decided that being quiet about it had not served him well, chose the worst possible moment to make his feelings known publicly. Crew was together at the midday meal. Everyone present, which was unusual. Normally some of the hands were still out on rotation, but the end of the drive had a consolidating effect, and 30 of the 31 men were eating in the same place at the same time when Harlan, sitting across from a man named Tully, said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Hard to figure what Rourke's thinking, wanting to bring the cook home. Man could find himself a real woman in Kansas. The camp went quiet, not the quiet of before, when men had looked away from his cruelty and said nothing because it was easier. A different quiet. The kind that happens when something has been said that the room has decided to pay attention to. She was at the wagon. She heard it. She stayed at the wagon. Silas had been sitting with Clement. He didn't move right away. He finished chewing. He set down his cup, and then he stood up, and the camp was already watching him, and he spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear without raising his voice at all. "I want to tell you men something," he said, since apparently it needs saying out loud. Nobody moved. Even the cattle seemed quieter. 3 weeks ago, this woman, he said it plainly, not defensively, noticed a storm coming 2 hours before anyone else. She had dry kindling packed since Abilene because she'd thought ahead, kept a fire going in conditions that should have killed it, and every man who came in out of that storm cold and wet and had something hot to drink should know he has her to thank for that. Harlan shifted slightly, didn't speak. She's been feeding this crew on a supply budget that was wrong when she inherited it, Silas continued. She's been watching which men are struggling and doing something about it without being asked. She fixed a supply problem I didn't know we had and told me about it straight. No drama, just the facts and a solution. He paused. She could feel the camp listening. And 10 days ago, he said, when my horse went into a prairie dog hole, and I was on the ground with the herd coming, this woman ran at that stampede on foot with a bullwhip she'd never used before. And she turned it. She turned it, and I am standing here because she did. The fire crackled. So when you say real woman, Silas said, turning his gaze to Harlan with a directness that didn't require volume to be felt, I want to know what you mean by that. Because from where I'm standing, I've got 30 men on this drive, and she's been the most dependable person out of all of us. Harlan said nothing. His face was doing something complicated and not particularly dignified. She comes to Montana, Silas said, and he was talking to the crew now, not just Harlan. She won't be below me. Stands beside me. That's the only way I'm asking it. The silence held for another moment. Then Clement said, from somewhere to her left, well, that's about right. And Wick said, yep. And Pete Garrett said nothing. But she could see from the corner of her eye that he was looking at the ground with the expression of someone trying not to show how much they were affected by something. Harlan ate the rest of his meal in silence. Briggs did too. Nobody asked them anything or looked at them with anything particular. The thing that happened to people who have been clearly wrong about something in a public setting happened to them. They became temporarily invisible, which was worse than being argued with, and probably, on some level, they knew it. She stayed at the wagon. She had heard every word. She wasn't sure what to do with what she'd heard it. Sat in her chest with a warmth she didn't want to examine too carefully in the middle of the day, in the middle of camp, with 30 men 15 feet away. Pete came by to return his plate. He stood for a moment, doing the shirt-tail cleaning thing. You heard that, he said. Yes, all of it? All of it. He nodded slowly, like he was processing something. Then he means it, you know. Rourke, he doesn't say things he doesn't mean. I know, she said. So what are you going to do? She looked at him, this 17-year-old boy, who had come on this drive because he needed the money and didn't know what else to do, who had collected firewood every morning and learned to read a fire and not talked about his father when that was exactly what he'd needed to not talk about. He was looking at her with the straightforward curiosity of someone who genuinely didn't know the answer and genuinely wanted to. I don't know yet, she said, but you're thinking about it. Pete, yes, ma'am. Go check the canvas covers on the left side of the wagon. They were loose this morning. He went. She watched him go and thought about Nolan, who had gotten old, and Elsie, who was managing or pretending to, and the difference, sometimes, between those two things. The last day and a half to Kansas was dry and fast, the terrain flattening out further, the trail widening where other cattle drives had passed through ahead of them and cut deep parallel lines into the earth. She watched the crew as they moved, the way they talked more, the way the horses moved differently when they knew they were close to somewhere, the particular anticipation that made even exhausted men sit slightly straighter in their saddles. She had made her decision somewhere between the midday meal and the afternoon of the final day. Couldn't have said exactly when. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It happened the way most real decisions happen, not in a single flash of clarity, but in the gradual acknowledgement that she had already decided and had been deciding for a while, and what remained was just the saying of it. She thought about what she had told herself on that flat rock, the thing she needed to know before Kansas. She thought about the honest accounting she had done of the mornings and the evenings and the fire, and what she actually felt versus what was fear wearing a different coat. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference. She had just needed time to be sure she was seeing it clearly. The drive reached the stockyard outside Caldwell in the late afternoon of the 41st day. The cattle went in. The accounting began. The men got their pay and scattered in the particular way that men scatter at the end of a long thing, some toward the saloon, and some towards the boarding house, and some just standing in the open air looking slightly lost. The way you look when the structure that's been organizing your days for 6 weeks suddenly isn't there anymore. She sat on the back of the chuck wagon, with her heels on the wheel, and watched the camp dissolve around her. Pete Garrett came to find her before he left. He was going south, back toward Texas, back toward his father, and he stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and looked like he was going to say something significant, and then said, "You make the best biscuits I've ever had." She almost laughed. She nearly did. "Good luck, Pete." "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat on, took it off again. "If you go to Montana," he said, "I think you'll be all right." "I'll be all right either way," she said. He thought about that. "Yeah," he said, "I know. I just meant—" He stopped. "Yeah." He put his hat back on and walked away, and she watched him go until he was out of sight. Clement left without much ceremony, which was right for Clement. Wick shook her hand, which surprised her, and seemed to surprise him slightly as well. Doss, whose cough had been mostly gone for the last week, tipped his hat at her without stopping, which she appreciated. Harlan walked past her without looking at her. She let him. She found Silas at the edge of the stockyard, going over the final count with a man from the buyer's office. She waited until they were done. He saw her waiting and came over. He looked at her face and seemed to understand that something had been decided, because he went stinty in the way. He went still when he was giving something his full attention. "I'll come to Montana," she said. He didn't say anything right away. She saw something move through his expression, not triumph, not relief, but something quieter than both. Something more like the exhale after a long time of holding a breath. "All right," he said. "I need you to understand some things first," she said. "Tell me. I will run your household the way I think it should be run, and if I think you're wrong about something, I'll say so. I won't manage your children as if they're a problem to be solved. And if it doesn't work," she paused. "I'm not a person who stays in something because leaving is hard. I need you to know that going in." He looked at her steadily through all of it. "I know that," he said. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks. "Good," she said. "Good," he said. The stockyard was loud around them. Cattle, men, the commerce of a cattle town, and they stood in it, the two of them, with the particular quietness of people who have just said something that matters and are not going to cheapen it by saying more. "Children," she said, after a moment. "Tell me more about them." And he did. He talked about Nolan, who kept the ranch ledger since his mother died, who checked the numbers twice and always found the error his father had missed. He talked about Elsie, who named every horse and remembered each name, who had stopped letting herself be afraid of things she'd been afraid of before her mother died, because she'd decided, at 8 years old, that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore, which was the most heartbreaking thing Mara had heard in some time. She listened. She listened the way she'd learned to listen, not waiting for the end, but taking in each thing as it came. Particular, specific details of 2 children she had never met, who were going to come home one day, and find a stranger in their house who was supposed to matter. She thought, "I don't know if I can do this." And then, "I don't know if I can" is not the same thing as "I won't." "When do we leave for Montana?" she said. 3 days, he said. "I have supply arrangements to complete. I'll make a list of what we'll need for the journey. I know you will." He almost smiled. The same almost smile she'd been cataloging for 6 weeks. "You've had it half written in your head since yesterday." She absolutely had. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he said. She walked back to the chuck wagon and sat on the back step and took out the small notebook she'd been using for supply calculations since Abilene, turned to a new page. At the top she wrote Montana. She looked at the word for a moment. Then she began to list what they would need. Montana was colder than she'd expected, even in late summer. She'd known it intellectually, had packed for it, had asked Silas the right questions, and adjusted the list in her notebook accordingly. But knowing a thing and standing in it are different countries, and when the wagon crested the last rise, and she saw the Yellowstone Valley spread out below her in the early September light, she felt the cold in her lungs before she felt anything else. Clean and sharp, and with an edge to it that the Kansas air didn't have, the kind of cold that came from elevation and open sky, and the fact that there was nothing between you and the mountains to the west that could slow the wind down. The ranch sat in a bend of a creek that fed into the Yellowstone a quarter-mile east. It was not a beautiful house, it was a practical house, built by someone who understood winter better than aesthetics, low and solid, with a wide covered porch and shutters that looked like they'd been repaired more than once. There were 2 outbuildings and a barn that was in better condition than the house, and a fence line that stretched further than she could see in the failing light. The land was enormous, in the way that Montana land is enormous, the kind of scale that took some adjustment, that made you recalibrate your sense of distance and proportion. 2 children stood on the porch. Nolan was taller than she'd imagined. 11 years old, but carrying himself like someone older, not in the way of a boy pretending to be grown, but in the way of a child who has genuinely had to take on weight before he was ready for it. He had his father's face, the same economy of expression, the same watchful quality that didn't give things away for free. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at Mara with an assessment that was so openly careful it would have been rude in an adult, but in an 11-year-old boy was simply honest. Elsie was smaller than she'd imagined, and more still, 8 years old, standing slightly behind her brother, not hiding exactly, but using the proximity, the way you use something solid when you aren't certain of your footing. She had dark hair and her mother's eyes. Mara learned later, though she didn't know that yet, on the porch, looking at this child who was looking back at her with an expression that said, "I have already lost one person who was supposed to be here. I am not in a hurry to make that mistake again." Mara understood that expression. She had worn it herself for most of the past year. Silas introduced her simply. He said, "This is Mara. She'll be living here with us." Nolan said, "Hello?" Polite, flat, revealing nothing. Elsie said nothing. She looked at Mara for a long moment, and then looked at her father, and then went inside the house. The door closed behind her, with a sound that was not quite a slam, but was firmly in that direction. Silas started to say something. "It's fine," Mara said. He looked at her. "She's not usually sick." "She's exactly what she should be," Mara said. "She doesn't know me. She shouldn't trust me yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." Nolan was still on the porch. He'd watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone taking notes. "Can I show you where Mrs. Alderman keeps things?" he said. It wasn't warmth. It was practicality, the offer of someone who has been managing a household longer than a child should have to, and who recognized another person who would need to understand how things worked. But it was also, she understood, the closest thing to an opening he was going to offer, on a first evening, and she was not going to mistake it for less than it was. "Please," she said. He showed her the kitchen first. He was thorough and precise where the staples were stored, which shelf held what, the particular quirk of the stove that required the left damper to be opened before the right, or the smoke drew wrong. He told her these things the way you tell someone, the facts they need to function, without commentary, without sentiment. She listened the same way. She didn't try to be warm. She didn't try to win anything. She just listened. When he was done, he looked at her with that careful, assessing look and said, "Mrs. Alderman makes the biscuits a certain way. Elsie likes them that way," described the method. She listened. "I'll talk to Mrs. Alderman," she said, "before she leaves." He nodded, seemed satisfied. "Dinner's usually at 6, he said. "Father's sometimes late." "I'll plan for 6:30, she said, "and keep something warm if it runs later." Another nod. Then he went to his room, and she stood in the kitchen of this strange house, in this enormous Montana landscape, and looked at the stove and the shelves and the window above the sink that faced west toward the mountains. And she thought, "All right." She did not think, "I can do this." She was past the point of needing to tell herself she could do things. She thought, "All right," and then she started making dinner. The first weeks were careful and quiet and harder than she'd expected in ways that had nothing to do with the work. The work was extensive, and she was good at it, and that part of things settled relatively quickly. The ranch ran on a rhythm that she identified and adapted to. Within the first few days, Silas out before light, back by noon on most days, back by dark on the long ones, the children to school in town on the days when the weather permitted. Nolan doing his ledger work in the evenings at the kitchen table with a concentration she found genuinely impressive. She learned the stove's particular temper, learned where the drafts came through in the walls when the wind shifted, learned which floorboard in the hall creaked, and which animals in the barn were calm and which were not. What she could not learn quickly, because it couldn't be learned quickly, was how to be in the same space as two grieving children without making it worse. Nolan was easier, because Nolan operated in the world of facts and tasks. He was not warm, but he was fair. He treated her with the same even consideration. He seemed to treat everything. And when she proved herself competent in ways he could verify, he adjusted accordingly. When she found the error in February's ledger that he'd carried forward for 3 months, an addition mistake that had compounded into a number large enough to matter. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I should have caught that." "You were working fast," she said. "You're always working fast." That's when addition mistakes happen. He looked at her. "You can do ledgers?" "I can manage numbers," she said. "I'm not formally trained, but I can check your work if you want me to." He considered this with the thoroughness he gave everything. Then, yes. After that, he brought the ledger to her on Sunday evenings. He still did his own work. She was clear that she was checking, not replacing, and he was clear that this was the arrangement he was accepting. But he'd sit at the kitchen table while she looked through it, and he'd answer her questions, and sometimes he'd tell her things about the ranch that she needed to know. Things Silas hadn't thought to mention because he'd lived with them so long, they'd stopped being notable. It was through the ledger that she came to understand what the ranch actually was. Not just the acreage and the cattle count, but the history of it the dry summer 3 years ago that had cost Silas a third of the herd, the fence dispute with the neighboring outfit that had dragged on for 2 years and cost money they hadn't had, the mortgage that was real and pressing, and had been the underlying reason for the cattle drive in the first place. The herd she'd helped bring north wasn't a luxury. It was what kept the ranch from being lost. She thought about this on the evenings when Silas came in, late trail dirty and tired in the bone-deep way that came from working land that didn't make anything easy. She thought about the weight of it, the land, the mortgage, the children, the absence of a person who'd been supposed to share it. And she thought about the particular human quality of continuing to do something that hard, day after day, because there was no acceptable alternative. She had a habit of continuing past the acceptable stopping point. She supposed that was something they had in common. Elsie was harder. Elsie was harder the way that tender wounds are harder, not because they're worse necessarily, but because they require a different kind of care, a more attentive and patient kind, and the wrong movement at the wrong moment made things worse rather than better. She did not push. She had decided from the porch that she would not push, and she kept to that decision even when it cost her, even on the evenings, when Elsie sat across the kitchen from her and looked at her with those careful dark eyes that held something so specific and so guarded that it made Mara's chest ache in a way she couldn't describe. Just stayed. She was there in the morning when Elsie came down for breakfast, and there in the evening when Elsie came back from school, and there on the Sundays when it snowed too hard for church, and the ranch felt very small and very far from everything. She didn't try to be what Elsie's mother had been. She didn't try to be anything specific. She just stayed, and she paid attention, and she tried to make the space between them feel safe, rather than demanding. She made the biscuits the way Mrs. Alderman had made them, the way Nolan had described. Elsie ate them without comment. That was fine. She started leaving a candle lit in the kitchen on the nights when Elsie had school the next day, because she'd noticed the girl came down sometimes in the early dark, not quite sleeping and not quite awake, and the lit kitchen seemed to help. She never mentioned it. Elsie never mentioned it. It was just a thing that happened. There were bad days. There were days when Elsie was actively cold, not cruel, because Elsie was not a cruel child, but sealed up in a way that made it clear she was keeping Mara at the farthest edge of her perimeter. There were days when the distance between them felt permanent rather than temporary, when Mara lay beside Silas in the dark and thought honestly about whether she had made a mistake, not about coming, but about believing she could make this work, that she was the right person for this particular, specific difficulty. Silas knew when those days happened. He'd developed, over the months, the same quality of attention she'd always had, the watching, the noticing. He'd come in from the range sometimes and just stand in the kitchen doorway while she was cooking and say nothing. And the nothing was its own kind of acknowledgement. I see that today was hard. I'm here. That's all I've got right now, but I'm here. Found that adequate. She found that on most days, more than adequate. The first real break with Elsie came in November, on a night when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and the wind came off the mountains, with a purpose that rattled every window in the house. She'd put the children to bed. At 8, Nolan going willingly, because he was tired from a day of hauling firewood. Elsie going with less willingness, but going. Silas was out with 2 of the ranch hands, dealing with a section of fence the wind had taken down on the north pasture. She'd left the kitchen candle lit and gone to bed herself around 10, and was not quite asleep when she heard it, a sound from Elsie's room. At first she thought it was the wind working through a gap somewhere, but it wasn't. It was a human sound, the kind of sound that has the specific quality of someone trying very hard not to make it. She got up. She knocked on Elsie's door softly, opened it without waiting, because waiting felt wrong. Elsie was in bed with her knees pulled up, and she was burning. Mara could feel the heat coming off her from 2 feet away, not the mild warm of a low fever, but the specific, alarming heat of a fever that has been climbing while the child slept and has gotten somewhere bad. She said, "Elsie, I'm here. How long have you felt like this?" Elsie's eyes were glassy in the way that meant the fever was affecting her thinking. She said something unclear. Then more clearly, "Since dinner." I didn't want to say. She didn't want to say. 8 years old and sick enough that she should have been frightened, and she hadn't wanted to say. Mara thought, "I understand that. And then we're going to have to talk about that later, when you're better." But right now there was a sick child and a temperature that was genuinely dangerous, and the doctor was in town 6 miles away in a November night that was currently trying to peel the roof off. She did what she knew to do. She'd grown up with a mother who had handled the practical business of illness, without ceremony, cool cloths on the neck and wrists, not ice cold, just cool, changed frequently, clear fluids, warm not hot, particular combination of willow bark and dried yarrow that her mother had kept in a cloth bag and which Mara had replicated in her own supplies because she had learned to think ahead for exactly this kind of situation. She worked steadily and without panic, because panic is a luxury you cannot afford when someone needs you to be the steadiest thing in the room. Elsie watched her from the pillow. The fever made her quieter than usual, stripped away some of the guardedness, left something more open and uncertain underneath. "Are you scared?" Mara asked, wringing out a cloth. "No," Elsie said. Then after a pause, "Yes, okay," Mara said. "That's okay. Is it bad?" She thought about how to answer this. Not dishonestly. She'd always found dishonesty to sick children more damaging than the truth in the end. Because they always knew anyway. "It's a high fever," she said. "We need to bring it down. That's what we're doing right now. Are you going to leave to get the doctor?" "No," Mara said. "Not while you're like this. I'm not leaving." Elsie was quiet for a moment. "Then promise?" Mara looked at her. This child with her mother's eyes, who had decided at 8 years old that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, who had been managing or pretending to for 2 years and maybe couldn't tell the difference anymore between the two. "I promise," she said. She stayed. She stayed through midnight and through 2 in the morning and through the worst of it, which came around 3, the fever spiking in the way. Fevers sometimes do before they break. The child's breathing shallow and too fast. Mara working steadily with the cloths, and the willow bark tea she'd managed to get into Elsie in small spoonfuls, talking when it seemed to help and quiet when it didn't. Silas came in from the range at 2:30, heard the sounds, and appeared in the doorway of Elsie's room, with a face that Mara would remember for a long time, the raw fear of a parent seeing a sick child. No management, no calculation, just the plain terror of it. She met his eyes across the room. She said steadily, "The fever is high. Think it's going to break. I need you to not panic." He took a breath, nodded. "Sit with her," she said. "I'll be right back." She went to the kitchen, remade the compressed tea, brought fresh cloths. She came back and he was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Elsie's hand, and Elsie was looking at him with the glassy, partially present look of a child who is sick enough to have let her guard down entirely. "Mara stayed," Elsie said to her father. Her voice was thready but clear. She said she wouldn't leave. "I know," Silas said. He looked at Mara across the room. "I know she did." The fever broke at 4:15. Not dramatically, fevers don't break dramatically. They break in the quiet, incremental way that better things generally come, a degree at a time until you check the cloth and it comes away merely warm instead of hot, and the breathing slows, and the child's eyes focus more clearly, and you exhale a breath you've been holding for 6 hours. Elsie fell asleep at 4:30 with her father on one side of the bed and Mara in the chair she'd pulled up on the other. Silas looked at Mara across the sleeping child. "Go to bed," she said. "You should sleep." "I'll sleep in the chair." "Go!" Mara Silas. She said his name the way he sometimes said hers. Just the name, carrying the rest of it. "I've got her. Go sleep for 2 hours. You have a fence to finish." He went. She sat in the chair and watched Elsie sleep and felt the particular quality of 4:30 in the morning, the way it was its own separate country from the rest of the night. Neither the depth of midnight nor the beginning of morning, just this particular still hour that existed between things. She thought about Thomas. She thought about how he would have handled a sick child with warmth and awkwardness, and a complete willingness to do whatever was needed, even if he didn't know how. She thought about the 14 months and the small house and the plans they'd had that hadn't come to anything. Thought about the fact that grief, which she had spent the past year and a half carrying in different positions, had shifted again without her noticing exactly when. Still there. It would probably always be there in some form, the way the scar on her hand was still there. A permanent record of what had happened, something written into the tissue. But it had moved to a place where she didn't run into it every time she reached for something else. She was not sure when that had happened. She was glad it had. Elsie woke at 6 with a fever that was low-grade and manageable, and eyes that were clearer than they'd been in 12 hours. She looked at Mara in the chair and seemed to register something about the fact that the chair was still there, that Mara was still in it. "You really stayed," she said. "I said I would." Elsie was quiet for a moment. She was 8 years old, and she had just spent a bad night, and she was not entirely herself yet, which was probably why. What happened next happened, the guardedness not back up yet, the usual distance not in place. She said, "My mother used to sit in that chair." Mara felt the weight of that land. She didn't look away from it. "I know," she said. "Your father told me. Do you think about her? When you sit there?" This was the most direct thing Elsie had ever said to her. She deserved a direct answer. "I think about her as someone I never got to meet," Mara said carefully. "Someone who loved you and Nolan and your father. I think about that. Think she'd mind? You being here?" This was a question that could go many ways, and Mara chose her answer carefully, not dishonestly but carefully, because Elsie ate and sick and deserved both the truth and kindness. "I think she wanted someone to be here for you," Mara said. "I don't know if that someone was going to be me, but I think she wanted you to be taken care of." Elsie thought about this with the focused consideration of someone who is applying their full cognitive resources to something important, even through a fever. "Nolan likes you," she said finally. "I know. I like Nolan. He doesn't like most people. I know that too." Another pause. Then, barely audible, "I think I like you too. A little." Mara looked at this 8-year-old child in her bed, with her mother's eyes, and the fever still faint in her cheeks, and the specific honesty that comes from a bad night, and 4:30 in the morning still being close enough to feel. "That's enough," she said. "A little is enough to start with." She made breakfast from the chair before Elsie was ready to get up, calling instructions to Nolan in the kitchen, who executed them with his usual precision and brought a tray that was, Mara had to admit, more organized than she would have managed from the kitchen herself. Silas came in at 8 to check on Elsie and found his daughter sitting up in bed, eating broth with what appeared to be the beginning of an opinion about it. He stood in the doorway and looked at the tableau, his daughter the tray, Mara in the chair, and his face did something that he didn't manage to control before she saw it. She looked away, because some things were private. After that, something shifted. It was not overnight. She would never describe anything in those children's lives as happening overnight, because it didn't, because real things don't, but it shifted with more intention than before. Elsie began appearing in the kitchen in the mornings, a little earlier, not to talk. At first, just to be there while Mara cooked, sitting at the table with her school things, occasionally looking up. Mara cooked and did not make anything of the company, because making something of it would have changed what it was. Elsie started asking questions. Small ones, practical ones. How did you keep the biscuits from getting flat? Why did you add that to the broth? What was that smell when you were working with the dried herbs on Tuesday? Mara answered each one directly, without making a lesson of it, because Elsie wasn't asking to learn. She was asking to make conversation, which was the better thing. The questions got bigger over time. They got personal. Elsie asked once, on a February morning, when the snow was so heavy it had canceled school, and the two of them were in the kitchen together for the whole day, what it was like to be on the cattle drive. Mara told her, honestly, without softening the hard parts, the flour shortage, the storm, Harlan Voss and his opinions about cold coffee. She told her about the stampede. She told her about Pete Garrett collecting firewood and being 17 and homesick and not talking about it. Elsie listened with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, completely still, the way she went still when she was genuinely interested in something. Were you scared on the stampede? Yes, Mara said. I was scared and I did it anyway. Why? Mara thought about how to answer this honestly. Because there wasn't time to stop and be scared separately, she said. And because the thing I was running toward mattered more than the thing I was afraid of. Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then that's what my father says about ranching. Thing you're working toward matters more than how hard it is. Your father's right about that. He's right about most things, Elsie said, with the resigned air of a child who has found this both reassuring and mildly inconvenient. Mara had to look out the window for a moment. Spring came slowly to that part of Montana, reluctantly. The way spring comes to places that have real winters, not a dramatic arrival, but a gradual softening, snow retreating to the shadows, mud replacing it, the creek running higher and faster than it had in months. The cattle that had wintered came through in reasonable shape. The fence dispute with the neighboring outfit resolved not elegantly. Nothing ever resolved elegantly, but it resolved in Silas's favor, through the combination of careful record-keeping and a county adjudicator who turned out to be the kind of man who read ledgers before he formed opinions. Nolan had brought Mara the relevant ledger entries 3 weeks before the adjudication. He'd marked the relevant figures with a small penciled bracket, neat and precise. Is that right? He'd said. The way I've calculated it? She'd gone through it carefully. Yes, she said. That's right. Good work, Nolan. He'd accepted this the way he accepted things, without visible reaction, nodding, filing it away. Then he'd said, Father doesn't always know how to read the numbers the way they need to be read in a dispute. He knows the facts, but not how to present them. Do you want to help him prepare? He looked at her. I thought you could. You're better at explaining things than I am. She hadn't expected that. The trust in it, the specific, practical trust of someone handing you a task because they believed you could do it, sat in her chest in a way that felt unexpectedly like something being given rather than something being earned. We'll both help him, she said. You know the numbers. I'll help with the presentation. They did. Silas looked at the two of them, his 11-year-old son and his wife of 6 months, sitting across the kitchen table from him, with the ledger between them. and he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "All right, tell me what I'm missing," they told him. He listened in the careful, complete way he had always listened. He made the case to the adjudicator the following week, and he made it well, and they won. He came home and told them at dinner. Nolan absorbed this with his customary precision, said, "Good," and went back to eating. Elsie said, "I knew we would," with the confidence of someone who has decided to be confident as a policy. And Mara said nothing, but she refilled Silas's coffee before he had to ask, which was the language she'd developed for things she didn't want to make into more than they were. Caught her eye across the table, the almost smile. 8 months, she'd learned to read it as fully as if it were the real thing. The months accumulated. She kept the ledger with Nolan on Sunday evenings, a habit that had calcified into ritual, the kind of ritual that meant something precisely because nobody had decided it would. It had just become what they did. She kept the candle lit for Elsie on school nights, long past the point where Elsie still came down in the dark, because now it was simply what the kitchen looked like in the evenings, and changing it would have felt wrong. She learned the land. She'd had no expectation of caring about it. She was from Missouri. She'd spent a year and a half in Kansas. The land had been background in her life, the context in which things happened rather than a thing itself. This land was different in a way she found herself unable to fully explain even when she tried. It had a quality of visibility. You could see weather coming from 50 miles, could see the season changing in the mountain color, weeks before you felt it on the ground, could stand at the edge of the creek in the early morning and see, all at once, everything the day was going to bring. She was standing at that creek on an October morning, 2 years after she'd arrived, when Silas came up behind her. He stood beside her in the quiet, looking at the same thing she was looking at, the mountains to the west going gold. In the early light, the creek running lower now than it had in summer. "Nolan wants to talk to you about expanding the south pasture," he said. "He's been working the numbers." "I know," she said. "He showed me the preliminary figures last Sunday." Silas looked at her. "He showed you before he showed me?" He wanted to check the calculations first. She paused. "They're sound. He's right about the south pasture." He shook his head slowly, in a way that was not disagreement. That boy is going to run this ranch better than either of us someday. I know it." He was quiet for a moment. "Elsie told me something last night." "What?" She said, "She wants to learn to work cattle from horseback. She's been talking to one of the hands." He paused. "She also said she told him you'd said it was all right." Mara considered this. "I didn't say that." "I know." She assumed. She did. He looked at the mountains. "Trusts your judgment." She was using it as shorthand. Mara thought about that. Elsie, who had stood behind her brother on the porch and said nothing, who had sealed herself up tight as a winter house, who had told her mother's chair that she thought she liked Mara, a little Elsie, who now used her name as a form of permission without thinking twice about it. "You'll tell her she needs to ask me directly," Mara said. "Yes. And what will you say when she does?" "That I'll talk to the hand first, and then we'll see." He almost smiled. She caught it this time, in the gold morning light, more fully than she usually did. There was genuine warmth in it, the real thing, the thing behind the almost. She'd learned to see it. "That's a yes," he said. "That's a we'll see," she said. "Different. In your vocabulary, we'll see is a yes with conditions." She thought about denying this and decided not to bother, because he was right, and they both knew it. She looked at the creek. The water ran over the stones with a sound that she had come to know the same way she knew the sound of the stove in the morning, the particular creak of the porch steps, the way the wind sounded different when it came from the north versus the west. These were the sounds of her life. She had not chosen them in advance. She had not known, sitting in that Abilene office in front of Silas Rourke's ledger, that this was what she was choosing toward. That was, she'd come to think, probably the only way it could have worked. She couldn't have chosen this deliberately from the outside. She could only have ended up here by doing the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next, by surviving each individual difficulty long enough to arrive at what came after it. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, after the children had gone to bed. The ledger was open in front of her, not Nolan's ranch ledger, but the small notebook she'd been carrying since Abilene, the one that had started as supply calculations and become something else over time. She'd filled most of it, and the filling was a record of the past 2.5 years, in the only language she'd ever been completely comfortable with. Numbers, lists, practical accounting of what things cost and what they required and what they produced. She turned to the back pages, found the entry she'd made on the last day in Kansas, on the back step of the chuck wagon, Montana, and beneath it, the list of what they'd need for the journey. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to a fresh page. She thought about what to write and couldn't find a list for it, because it wasn't a list kind of thing. So she just sat for a moment with the pen in her hand, her right hand, the one with the healed, crooked skin across the palm, the permanent record of the stampede written into the tissue, and she thought about what was true. What was true was that she had come on a cattle drive because she had no other choice, and had found, somewhere in the dust and the fire and the 41 days of relentless, unglamorous work, that she was more capable than she had known. What was true was that she had said yes to Montana not from fear or desperation, but from something more solid, and that the difference between those things had mattered more than she could have explained to anyone who had in the position of having to know it. What was true was that 2 children who had had every reason not to trust her had found their way to trusting her anyway, not because she'd performed anything or tried to be someone she wasn't, but because she had stayed. Because she had been there in the morning and in the evening, and at 4:15 when the fever broke, and on the Sunday ledger evenings, and on the February snow day, and at every ordinary meal that had accumulated over time into the proof of something. What was true was that the grief she'd carried for Thomas was still there, would probably always be there, and that this was all right, that grief and the fullness of a present life were not opposites. That you could carry one inside the other, without either one canceling the other out. She had not replaced what she'd lost. You did not replace things that had been genuinely yours. You carried them, and you also kept living, and the carrying became part of the living, and eventually the weight of it became familiar enough that you forgot it was there until you reached for something and felt it and thought, oh, yes, that's still with me. And that was all right. What was true was that she was sitting in a kitchen in Montana with a ledger in front of her, and 2 children sleeping in the next rooms, and a man who said what he meant and listened when she talked. And the mountains were outside, and the creek was outside, and the land she had not known, she would love was outside, and none of it, not one piece of it, had been given to her. She had worked for all of it, had earned every fraction of it, with the specific currency of her own stubbornness and capability, and willingness to keep going past the point where stopping would have been acceptable. She had been the widow nobody saw, the young woman in the black dress, with the composed expression that people read as coldness, cook on the cattle drive, the furniture that moved around on its own, the plain little cook in Harlan Voss's particular and limited vocabulary. She had been all of those things, and none of them had been the whole truth, because the whole truth was something that took time to become visible, that required distance and accumulation, and the willingness of the person themselves to keep showing up until it was undeniable. The truth was that she was not passing through anymore. She had not been passing through for a long time. She closed the notebook. She looked around the kitchen, the stove, the shelves, the window above the sink that faced the mountains. The candle she kept lit out of a habit that had started as care and become something closer to love. She looked at all of it with the particular attention she'd always had, the watching and the noticing that had kept her alive on the trail and had kept her present in this house through the hard first months and had become, over time, not a survival strategy, but simply the way she moved through her life. She was 23 years old. She had buried a husband and walked into a cattle drive and turned a stampede and come to a country she'd never seen and earned the trust of 2 children who had had every reason to withhold it. She had built a home with her own hands. Not with luck, not by being chosen, not by waiting for someone to see her worth and decide to act on it. She had built it the way she'd built everything out of what was available, through conditions that were difficult, with the stubborn, practical insistence that the next thing was possible, even when she couldn't see what it was yet. Some people come into their lives like they were always meant to be there, and some people have to make their lives, piece by piece, out of whatever the world gives them and whatever they refuse to give back. Mara Whitlock, Mara Rourke now, though she still thought of both names as hers, because both of them were, had always been the second kind of person. She had simply needed long enough and enough difficulty, and enough miles of hard country behind her to understand that the second kind was not the lesser kind. It was, in fact, the kind that lasted. She blew out the candle. She went to bed. And outsides, the Montana night did what it had always done, enormous and cold, and full of stars indifferent to human stories, as it always was, as it always would be. But she was in it. She was part of it, and she was exactly where she had made herself belong.